Hey guys, what's going on? We're about to get into the develop module here in Lightroom, but I wanted to do a quick video on RAW versus JPEG files. So some of you might be new to photography. Maybe you've got a fancy new DSLR camera. You're coming from a point and shoot camera or your phone, and you're used to seeing those .jpg files. And your new camera might have the option to shoot in RAW. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the differences between the two, why you might want to choose one over the other. So I personally shoot RAW, and RAW is the format of the files that I'm going to be using in the rest of this course. So the way you want to think about this is think about JPEG files as sort of like your camera has already developed or processed the photo. So in your camera, maybe you have some settings where you want to set it to black and white, or you have like this a real vivid settings, or maybe it's a flat neutral setting. When you shoot a JPEG file, all of that, the white balance and the settings, all of that gets baked into the photo. And it's a more compressed size, so the size of the JPEG is a little bit smaller than a RAW file size, and in some cases it can be a lot smaller. With a RAW file, what you're doing is you're essentially you're saying to the camera, no, I don't want you to process the file. I want you to give me the raw image data coming from the sensor and let me process it using a program like Lightroom. So you can use JPEGs in Lightroom, but to really see where Lightroom shines and unleash the true power of Lightroom, shooting in RAW is going to be a lot better. And if you're able to handle the file size of the RAW files, then I would highly recommend doing it. So if size is an issue, you can look into using something called Smart Previews. I'm sure if you just look on YouTube, you can find another video on how that works. I might do a video on that later. I'm not really going to get into it as part of this course. But if you can handle the size space on your hard drive, I recommend shooting RAW. So in practical terms, the differences between the two files, I can show you right now. Let's see here. How do I get this out? Let me just get my ugly mug out of the way here. All right, so here's just a series of photos. You can see what I did was I set my camera to shoot both RAW and JPEG each time it shoots, just so you can see the differences between the files here. So these are both the same image, except this one is a JPEG and this one is a RAW. So if I double click, you can see here's the JPEG, here is the RAW file. Now you can see that there's a little bit of a difference between the RAW file. The RAW file is using a profile from my camera that came over with it. I didn't think to match the profiles between both of these. So there is a little bit of a difference here, but for the most part, the images are pretty much the same. So let me just jump over to the develop panel. And these are all the fun settings we're going to be getting into later in this course. But one of the things you'll notice as I switch back and forth between the two, the first thing you'll notice is the white balance. So this section right here, the white balance or the color balance, you can see here, this is the RAW file. And if I go back to the JPEG, you can see it starts off in the middle. Now with a JPEG, it will always be in the middle here. And with a RAW file, it will always be where you set it in the camera. And what's handy about the RAW file is I can change this. So say, for example, I shot this. Right now it's set to as shot, but you can see these are all of the RAW, all of the white balance settings in my camera. So I have daylight, cloudy, shade. So say I shot this under shade, and you can see it adjusted the temperature slider over here when I set it to shade. Say I shot this picture in shade, and when I got back to Lightroom, I said, oh man, this is way too warm. I don't like this. I need to cool it down a bit. If you shoot RAW, you can simply change it right here. So maybe I want to go to cloudy. As you can see, it cools off the photo a little bit more. Or daylight, and it cools it down even more. With the JPEG photo, you can see I don't have all those different presets for the white balance. And because the slider is default set to the middle every time, when I try to adjust it, say I want to cool it down a little bit, you can see as I get down to about here, which was over in the RAW file, you can see the sliders all the way over here as well, and you can see the color looks a lot better, but over in the JPEG, the slider's in the same spot, and it looks like this horrible blue color. And that's because the JPEG is a more compressed file, and you can't edit the color balance as easily as you can a RAW file, because there just isn't as much information there to work with. And the more you try to push some of these settings, the worse the image is going to look. It's going to look really digitized. It's going to look muddy, washed out, crappy. So that's one of the main benefits to shooting RAW, is that you can adjust the color balance and some other related color settings after the fact without it looking all messed up like it does here. So once again, here's the RAW file. You can see the color balance looks a lot better. And then over here on the JPEG, after I tried to change it after the fact, it looks all blue, washed out, and gross. So let me just reset that here. Go back to the RAW file, reset that as well. So the other thing you want to kind of think about is the exposure settings. So say, here's another example where we have two pictures, pretty much the same exposure settings, and you can see they look really washed out. With the JPEG file, if you were to try to bring the exposure down and sort of try to bring back some of those highlights, you could see you can't really get it looking all that good. It's all kind of washed out and muddy. If I go over to the RAW file and I try to bring the exposure down a little bit, you can see like just how much better the photo is. It saves these tones that get washed out here, and it allows you to salvage the photo. Where if you were shooting JPEG, you might not be able to save it as well, or the more you try to push the exposure, the worse it's going to look. And in the RAW file, you'll have a lot more leeway. Same thing where if you underexpose a photo. In this example, this one is underexposed. This is the RAW file. I'm going to start bringing the exposure up. And then over here on the JPEG, if I try to bring the exposure up, it just looks muddy. It just doesn't, the colors look a little bit washed out. You can see here's the RAW file, here's the JPEG. The colors are just sort of flat and washed out, and it just doesn't have that same clean look as the RAW file. So those are the main benefits to shooting RAW over JPEG. You just have a lot more control, a lot more creative freedom, a lot more leeway. You're able to save photos that you may have messed up, or you can change your settings after the fact. The same thing goes with black and whites. You can easily change a RAW file to a black and white and back to color, where in a JPEG file, if you shoot it black and white in camera, you're going to get that JPEG as a black and white, and it's going to be a lot harder to put color back into that photo than you otherwise would if you had been shooting RAW. So again, I shoot RAW. I'm going to be using RAW files for examples in this course. So if you're following along at home and you're trying to use JPEGs and you're wondering why you're just not seeing the same sort of effects, it's probably because I have RAW files and you are shooting JPEG. So if you can switch your camera over to RAW, you're going to have a much better time in Lightroom, and highly recommend doing so. One last thing, RAW files don't have a .RAW extension. They are a proprietary format based on the camera manufacturer. So in my example, I shoot Nikon. These RAW files are .NEF. Canon has their own RAW files. Panasonic, Olympus, Fujifilm, they all have their own proprietary RAW format. I think Panasonic's are like .PS1 or something like that. So yeah, you won't see a .RAW file. So just a heads up, if you're looking for the files, it's going to be whatever your camera manufacturer has set. So that's the main differences between RAW and JPEG. You just have more data, more leeway, and because of that, the file sizes are larger. So if you can shoot RAW, do it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one as we start diving into exposure and the histogram. See you in the next one.